It's a small sample, about 30,000 individuals in sub-Saharan Africa in one part of one continent not too long ago. And now we've had a pretty good run so far. Don't know if how long it'll last, but it's been a pretty good fast run here for the last couple 100,000 years. I do want to emphasize the small sample part of what you said. When the Homo sapiens were coming out, let us say, or emerging, they would have interacted with a pretty wide range of other bipedal hominins that also were pretty smart. We don't interact with other smart bipedal hominins today. We're all pretty much the same. We're a genetically very similar species, in part because of this small sample size and the differences that we see and we talk about races and ethnicities and those things emerged pretty recently in our human history, probably as we talked about it within the last 40 or 50,000 years. Not very evolutionarily deep and not very big as compared to what these early Homo sapiens would have interacted with. And we talked about this in the last class, but I'm going to show it to you again that the Homo sapiens emerge from Africa and then go out to populate the globe in stages. So if we think about this, they give you this nice little map. Now these years, the numbers you see are thousands of years. So again, this is a recent expansion, and the numbers that they give you are thousands of years ago, not millions. We're now talking in the thousands. So some of these numbers are approximate, though. Again, thinking about 200,000 years ago, although, as I thought I told you, we've also seen some Homo sapien type skulls found around 300,000 years ago in Morocco. So it probably was something that occurred across the continent of Africa, and there is a population of Africa itself. And then we see this emergence into what is now the Middle East or Saudi Arabia at about 70, 75,000 years ago. And just to anticipate, that's probably when these Homo sapiens were interacting the most with Neanderthals in this area of the world, in the Middle East. And there was a lot of interaction, and probably that was a time that they were together for thousands of years in the Middle East. As I mentioned, one of the most amazing things that happens relatively early on is that Homo sapiens go further than any Homo erectus population ever did. Remember, we did see some Homo erectus populations in Indonesia, and they cross over into Australia at about 65,000 years ago, which is an amazing feat. You had to cross a pretty large body of water and then populate the whole continent of Australia by about 40,000 years ago. Now, there they stop. They didn't, the people who ended up indigenous to New Zealand, that was actually a much later migration that came from these islands. That was a much later migration. By the way, this is a very long distance away. So by sea, it's pretty hard to cross that. So it took a much later migration to do that. We see Homo sapiens spreading into both Europe and parts of Asia at about 40 to 50,000 years ago. In this area of Siberia at about 25,000 years ago, and then into the Americas 15 to 16,000 years ago is basically our best estimate for now. We use the term modern in a couple different ways to distinguish what the Homo sapiens that emerge in Africa and then populate the world, how they would be. So there's the idea of being what we call anatomically modern, which is a weird thing to think about, but it basically means that they are remains that would be biologically within the range of us. If we found them today, they would be within the human range of today's human beings. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens, we find at about 200, maybe a little bit earlier, 250, 300,000 years ago in Africa. So that's why we say they're anatomically modern. We're talking about the biological stuff. There's another term that they use in terms of being modern, allowed them to adapt and thrive. So we're thinking about behavioral modernity. Then we're thinking about things that allows you to adapt and thrive, being able to plan different things, being able to communicate, being able to coordinate yourselves so you can arrive to things, being able to structure your life, being able to think in a complex way. And we see these things emerge around 150,000 years ago, again in Africa. So we think that there's a little bit of a gap between when people became what we call biologically modern or anatomically modern, and when we see evidence of behavioral modernity. If you can see, there's about a gap there. But the more that we found, the more that I believe, and I think the evidence shows, is that behavioral modernity emerges again first in Africa and then accompanies is the way in which it is behavioral modernity which allows these Homo sapiens to populate the rest of the world and do the Homo sapien thing and get us to eventually to 8 billion people today. Now, for a long time, people thought that there was a huge gap between anatomical modernity and behavioral modernity. That in some ways, people would look at, say, the cave paintings in France and Spain from around 40,000 years ago, and they're like, whoa, how did people do this? These are amazing. There must have been some burst which gave people behavioral modernity. And so people believe that there is this huge difference or gap or time lag between being anatomically modern and being behaviorally modern. I think the evidence is coming in now that the reason people believed that there was this gap was in part because there was not much archaeology being done in Africa. That is to say, most of the archaeologists and people that were digging up old stuff were in Europe. And so they were looking for caves and things like that in Europe. And that's where they found them. And that's where they're like, oh my gosh, behavioral modernity. The more we've actually been able to find of archaeology that is now being done in Africa, the more it seems that things like art actually probably emerged more in Africa first and then spread into the rest of the world. So we don't see the cave paintings in Africa, or we haven't found them yet, but we do see people making pigments or paints, different colors and body ornament, probably mostly for body ornamentation, carving different figurines, those kinds of things. And we see those as early as 100 or 75,000 years ago in Africa. And then, in one of the more amazing finds, and this is fairly recent, at least that we've been able to do this dating, we see cave paintings in both France and in Indonesia from about 45,000 years ago. Now, I've underlined and I'm harping on the Indonesia part a little bit. Most of us know about the cave paintings in France and Spain, and they're super cool and amazing, and I don't want to downplay them. But the thing is that we've also found cave paintings of equal or perhaps even longer time depth in Indonesia at around 45,000 years ago. What does that mean? That means that the people who emerged from Africa were already carrying all the elements of what we would call behavioral modernity. It developed differently in different regions of the world, but that package of things that allows people to adapt, thrive, and do things like art was already with us in our African origins. This is one of the cave paintings in Indonesia that we found. Again, a complex dating to get these dates at about 45,000 years ago, but pretty cool stuff. Language and speech. Yeah, so it's very difficult to get a sense of what was going on in the past in terms of language. Language does not fossilize. But we know that to do behavioral modernity, to get that symbolic transmission across generations, that you had to have some form of communication and language. Now, there are some things that do fossilize in terms of bones and things like that. So this is pretty cool. This hyaloid bone, it's evidence that perhaps that we do see language going on. This spans several of these human groups, so it's not necessarily unique to Homo sapiens, but it speaks to the fact that if we're going to transmit things across groups, communicate within a group across generations, you need to be able to use symbolic communication and use language. Now, we talked about how Homo erectus was probably pretty close, maybe language ready. Maybe they were doing some of this, and probably some of these other middle Pleistocene Homo groups that we talked about were also doing language. Some of the Neanderthals may have done it too, but with Homo sapiens, there seems to be enough evidence that we see both in the artifacts that there was symbolic communication. Again, this doesn't fossilize very well, and you can pinpoint different genetic things, but those again are difficult to say how much language people were using. What we see here is Homo sapiens being able to spread into these different areas, not necessarily because they were adapted to all these different climates. In fact, they weren't adapted. They were not specially adapted to all these different climates. Later on, there were certain biological variations that emerge in different climate regions, which we talked about, but that isn't the main way in which people were able to spread out. Making many more specialized tools. You have a much more advanced toolkit than we saw before, and so able to change their environment, able to change things in order to adapt the environment to them. So Homo sapiens are able to go into more extreme climates than any bipedal creature had been able to do before. Again, this wasn't necessarily because they were better adapted biologically. It's because they were able to use these tools and adapt their toolkit and adapt themselves and their culture to these different environments. We see evidence here for fitted clothing, starting to stitch together things like animal hides or plant fibers, put that onto their bodies to warm themselves up and adapt to different environments. How do we know that there was fitted clothing? It usually doesn't preserve very well, archaeologically speaking. The fitted clothing goes away because of the lice. You're looking at me like I'm crazy, but it is. It's because of the lice. We know that about 50, 75,000 years ago, there was a divergence between the species of head lice and body lice. And body lice can only live and thrive because of clothing. So if you want to blame your body lice on something, you can blame it on clothing. But that's how we know that people were adapting this fitted clothing. It is also how we know that, as we'll learn later, that they were using different shelters, and there's different types of lice than creatures that evolved to live with us in our houses. Now, of course, these shelters do give these Homo sapiens an advantage in that if you can construct different things in different climates, you're able to then survive and thrive in those areas. We also see all throughout Homo sapien history that these groups trade with each other. They exchange things with each other. They swap genes around. They interact and interbreed with each other. So we have, even though you have this big expansion outside of the Homo sapien range, we have a continual exchange of genetics so that they always remain one interbreeding species. And we also have exchange of stuff. So we start to see stuff that was produced in one area being traded all along these trade routes that start from a long time ago, both within Africa, people trading things across Africa and across Eurasia, eventually across Australia as well. Of course, Australia, like the Americas, would become continentally cut off from others, but they continued to trade within those areas. And when these peoples came back together, and about 500 years ago, they were still one interbreeding species, and they began this long distance trade and exchange again. So Homo sapiens are very famous from the beginning at being able to trade things around, their genes and their stuff and ideas across a range. And that's one of the things that unites us as human beings. So this is not a story of small, isolated groups that develop differently. It's a story of Homo sapiens expanding and then trading and exchanging with each other.